brothers and sisters, here and in the diaspora in so many ways. But in those days, it was the dark ages. And Edward was a Socratic and a prophetic light. And he does it in the context of the Academy of Literary Studies, literary criticism. And he says we must be committed to secular criticism. And by secular, all he meant was mustering the will, the heroic will, to be contra any method, any system, any orientation, any school of thought that thinks it has a monopoly on truth, especially when it is rendering the voices of oppressed people invisible or marginal. By secular, he had to fight against the post-structuralists, the Foucaults and the Derridas and Deleuze and others. People would run around and think, Edward Said is a postmodernist. No, that's not true. He's calling into question human will. He's calling into question human volition. That's not true. He's using any insights he can from any form of intellectual weaponry, be it Deleuze, Derrida, or Foucault. But he's got his own trajectory, and it is one of a radical humanist intellectual trajectory. Same would be true in terms of his talk about worldly criticism. You always begin with the complex circumstances. You always begin with being situated, so you know formal system will make sense of the lived experience of persons. There's no algorithm, there's no framework that is deodorized that can do justice to the funk of everyday people's struggles. That's why he loves C.L.R. James, because James's Marxism was always tempered by that which didn't fit. That's what he loved about Adorno, the cross grains that are not subsumable under any system, what the Greeks call a topos, the unclassifiable things. And that's one of his reasons why he remained distant from Marxism. He and I had long discussions about this, because Edward Said had a way of lecturing about Antonio Gramsci for an hour and a half. And you'd never know Gramsci was a Marxist. He just called him counter-hegemonic. In opposition. I said, well, he's more than that now. He's a communist now, brother. Well, that's not important, Brother West. Well, it is important. He got a class analysis here. But his formation was one in which he was always suspicious, because his conception of Marxism was one as a method and a system, and his conception of secular criticism is to hold all methods and systems at arm's length, to be flexible and fluid enough to keep track of what is true to the lived experience of people who are struggling, and at the same time ensure that those oppressed people are self-critical too. We can talk about his critiques of the PLO, his struggles with Yasser Arafat, his willingness to take a stand in the Palestinian context and ensure that self-criticism held across the board, even if that made him unpopular among Palestinians themselves, even as he's living under death threat in the American hegemon. Boy, that's a special brother. Very, very special brother indeed. He and I had deep struggles over popular culture, and I think when we talk about Edward Said and all of his genius and all of his capacious imagination, there are a number of blind spots. I want to just note one or two before we move into the present situation. That Edward Said had a certain disparaging view of popular culture. He was a highbrow radical humanist. He thought Adorno was right about jazz, which upset me deeply. Adorno had a very, very negative view about jazz. He didn't see the genius bubbling up from Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and Sarah Vaughan and John Coltrane and Miles Davis. But the jazz that he was talking about was Glenn Miller, so I could understand. You just have to be very mindful of which particular slices of jazz you're talking about. Somebody write a dissertation on Kenny G and say jazz is not worth spending a lot of time. I understand. Okay, fine. Listen to a little Coltrane, straighten you out. But it was popular culture in general. And this is very interesting because really it was the first time I saw Edward embrace popular culture when he wrote about Palestinian culture. You can't write about After the Last Sky. You can't write about the poetry. You can't write about the songs unless you immerse yourself in not just highbrow humanist culture, but the genius that's flowing from below as well. And I tried to catch him on this. He said, well, I'm talking about Palestine. I'm not talking about America. Because he followed Adorno. America's about mass culture. Popular culture is mass culture, manipulated from above, market-driven, tied to instant gratification, body stimulation, and titillation. And he's right about much of American popular culture, but that's not all of it. That's not all of it. But the challenge is, especially with the younger generation, this was the challenge that he had for the younger generation, who have been so shaped by popular culture. How will you connect with them if your discourse is centered on Jane Austen and Flaubert and Gramsci and Kafka and T.S. Eliot and does not in any way have something to say about the popular artists of the day? It could be a Bob Dylan or a Carole King. It could be Gil Scott-Heron or the Last Poets, or the Cornel West theory these days. We got Brother Tim Hicks, who's one of the leaders of the Cornel West theory. And I say that not because they named it the group after me, but because they are telling some musical truths from the bottom up, with Mumia Abu-Jamal and Angela Davis and others on the album, making that connection. It's a challenge for Edward Said's legacy. Very difficult challenge, it seems to me. And at the same time, given the changes that have taken place since he died, September 2003, both in the United States as well as in the Middle East, you see, how do we keep his legacy alive? Speaking truth to power, self-critically, bearing witness, tied to the most sophisticated analysis of the day, of the economy, of culture, but also of self-transformation. Edward was in no way hermetic or privatistic, but he was deeply individualistic in terms of style, and sometimes very lonely and isolated. But how do you keep his legacy alive in a moment in which the market now saturates every nook and cranny of our culture, including the academy, with the corporatizing, commercializing, and marketizing taking place in the academy? Very different kind of academy that Edward Said was a part of. In a culture in which everything is for sale, everybody's for sale. Not just here, but in the Middle East too. The need, the muster, the courage to think critically, the courage to empathize, the courage to organize, the courage to hope, more and more difficult in such a market-saturated society, empire, and world. And then the other blind spot of Edward Said, which is that of